Pregnant and abandoned, woman finds money in the trash and makes a decision that will shock everyone. Sarah Thompson was lying on the narrow bed of the small apartment, her hands resting on her growing belly. The sunlight filtered through the cheap curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. The space was filled with the familiar smell of cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant, mixed with the perfume Sarah used to try to mask the constant odor of poverty that lingered around her. It was a summer afternoon, and the intense heat made the environment feel even more stifling. The apartment door creaked open, and James Thompson walked in, his face carrying an expression Sarah knew all too well. She slowly got up, the weight of her pregnancy making her movements heavy and tired. "James, you're back," she said, trying to force a smile. James didn't respond immediately. He left the key on the table and sat on the edge of the bed, removing his shoes with an abrupt gesture. Sarah watched, noticing the tension in his shoulders and the way he seemed to avoid looking at her. "We need to talk," James finally said, his voice tense. Sarah's heart began to race. She had feared this moment. They had argued about many issues recently, but she never thought he would actually walk away. She sat beside him, her hands nervously intertwined in her lap. "About what?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm. James sighed and looked at the floor. I don't know how to say this, Sarah." James's unease only made Sarah's fear grow. "What happened? You're scaring me." He finally looked at her with a gaze that mixed guilt and coldness. "I've met someone else." The words were like a punch to Sarah's stomach. She leaned back on the bed, trying to process what she had just heard. "Someone else? James, you can't be serious. We're expecting a baby. Are you just going to leave us?" "I can't keep living like this," James said, his voice breaking. I have a mistress, and I've decided to be with her. I can't live this lie anymore." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. "And me? What will happen to me? To our child?" James shook his head, unable to find words that could offer any comfort. I can't do anything for you right now, but I'll leave some money so you can manage until you find a solution." He stood up, grabbed the small bag of money he had left on the table, and handed it to Sarah. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by for a few months. James headed for the door without another word and left, leaving Sarah alone, surrounded by the coldness of solitude and the weight of the responsibility she now carried alone. Sarah sat there, her gaze lost in the void. The pain was almost physical, and the fear of the future felt overwhelming. With a deep sigh, she tried to compose herself. She needed to find a way to move forward, to build a life for herself and for the baby that was on the way. In the following days, Sarah faced the harsh reality of her new life. The apartment that once seemed cramped and uncomfortable now felt like a prison, filled with painful memories. With every step she took, the reality of her situation became clearer. Without James, without any support, she would have to find a way to support herself and the child who was about to be born. She spent most of her time looking for jobs, but opportunities were scarce. Without formal qualifications and with an uncertain future, Sarah found herself forced to take temporary and poorly paid jobs just to survive. The hours dragged on, and she struggled with the physical and emotional wear of a life that seemed increasingly difficult. The sun set over the city, casting an orange light over the dirty and crowded streets. Sarah walked through the streets, her gaze fixed on the ground, reflecting on the new and challenging path she needed to follow. She had no idea how drastically her life would change, but she was determined to face whatever came with courage for the sake of her future and her child's future. As James moved on with his mistress, Sarah faced alone the weight of responsibility and the hope for a better tomorrow. The world seemed unrelenting and cruel, but she had no choice but to move forward in search of a life that, despite its uncertainty, might still hold some glimmer on the horizon. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Sarah Thompson got up that morning, her body heavy and sore from the previous weeks. The apartment was still silent, except for the faint murmur of the city beginning to wake. Sarah grabbed her tattered coat, the same one she wore every day, and stepped out, facing the cool morning air with a mix of exhaustion and determination. Sarah's first stop was the city's waste collection point. The job was not glamorous, but it was an opportunity to earn some money to support herself and the baby on the way. She walked through the streets, observing the heaps of garbage scattered everywhere, each containing a mix of food scraps, paper, and other unwanted items. Sarah joined the other scavengers already at the site, men and women of various ages and backgrounds, all searching for the same goal, finding something of value among the waste. She grabbed her hand truck and headed to the area where the bags were being dumped. The smell was almost unbearable, a mix of decomposition and filth that seemed to seep into her clothes and skin. As she worked, Sarah leaned over the bags, unfolding them carefully and with hope. Sometimes she found items that could be sold or reused, such as used clothing or damaged household goods. Each time she found something that seemed valuable, she felt a brief moment of relief, followed by the frustration of knowing that the money earned would be insufficient to cover her needs. Sarah's hands were covered in dirt and cuts, and the sun began to heat up, making the work even harder. She paused for a moment to refresh herself with some water, feeling exhaustion take over her body. The intense heat made her face sweat, and her legs trembled with each movement. She questioned whether she had made the right choice by taking this job, but she knew there was no other alternative. The alternative was hunger and lack of shelter, and that was a prospect she couldn't face. The work of a garbage scavenger was physically exhausting and emotionally draining. Sarah struggled to keep hope alive as she spent her days sifting through debris and filth, always thinking of the baby to come. She imagined the future, dreaming of a safer and more comfortable place for her child, far from the suffering and hardships she faced. The vision of a better home kept the flame of hope alive, even when everything seemed against her. Sometimes, Sarah talked to some of the other scavengers, trying to distract herself from the pain and fatigue. She heard stories of harsh and challenging lives, similar to her own, and it made her feel a little less alone. There was a silent camaraderie among them, a mutual understanding of suffering and the struggle for survival. One of the women Sarah frequently spoke with was Martha, an elderly woman with the wise and weary look. Martha had spent her whole life struggling to stay afloat and offered words of encouragement to Sarah whenever they could talk. "You have to keep fighting, dear," Martha would say with a gentle smile. "Every day you get through is a day closer to something better." Sarah knew Martha was right, but the daily struggle seemed endless. She dreamed of days when she wouldn't have to worry about the next rent payment or the amount of food she could buy. For now, though, her only focus was surviving day by day. As the sun set and night fell, Sarah returned to the apartment, her body aching and exhausted. She prepared a simple meal and barely managed to eat, her mind filled with worries and doubts. The baby inside her moved, and the movement reminded her of why she was fighting so hard. Every kick and movement reminded her that there was something worth fighting for, and it helped her face another day. The sound of the city at night was different, softer, but still constant. Sarah looked out the window, watching the city lights and imagining a brighter future. She thought about what life would be like for the baby and how she could offer him a better future, away from the poverty and suffering she knew so well. Hope was the only thing that kept her standing, even when everything seemed to crumble around her. Every small triumph, every piece of hope found among the trash, was a reminder that she had to keep fighting. And so, with renewed determination, Sarah prepared to face another day of hard work, always in search of a better future for herself and her child. The day was hot and muggy, as was common during those summer weeks. Sarah Thompson walked through the streets, her hand truck nearly full of collected items. The work was becoming a painful routine, but she had adapted to the process. Sarah's mind, however, was constantly preoccupied with the future and her precarious living conditions. She crouched down to investigate a particularly large and heavy garbage bag, somewhat unusual. The bag was torn on one side, and Sarah carefully began to sift through its contents. At first, she found only food scraps and packaging, but something more solid caught her attention. With some effort, she pulled out an object stuck among the waste and realized it was a large, dirty suitcase. Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking at the suitcase. It was an unexpected item among the piles of trash she was used to finding. She lifted it carefully, her heart racing. With the labor and physical strain she endured daily, the suitcase seemed like a sign of something that could change her life. Still, she was apprehensive. What would she do with a suitcase full of money if that's what was inside? She decided to open the suitcase right there, the desire to see what was hidden outweighing her fear. With some effort, Sarah unlocked the rusty padlock and opened the suitcase. What she found inside left her speechless. Bundles of banknotes, stacked and organized with precision. The amount of money was immense, more than she had ever seen in her life. Awe and disbelief overwhelmed her, mixed with a sense of despair and guilt. Sarah sat on the ground next to the suitcase, her mind racing. The temptation to use the money to solve her problems immediately was overwhelming. She could pay all the bills, ensure a comfortable future for the baby, and finally escape the misery she was in. But at the same time, she knew that the way she had found the money was not ethical. The moral and emotional dilemma was crushing. She thought about all the people who might be searching for the suitcase. It was possible that someone was desperately trying to find that money, perhaps someone in a situation as dire as hers. Sarah knew that even with her own need, the right thing to do would be to return the money to its rightful owner. After a long reflection, Sarah decided to return the suitcase. She believed that her own sense of morality and ethics was more important than any immediate gain she could have. There was something inherently wrong about keeping what wasn't hers, and she made an effort to keep her principles intact, even in the face of desperate need. The call was answered by a polite and professional voice. Sarah explained the situation and provided the information she had. The person on the other end of the line seemed impressed by Sarah's honesty and promised that the company would do its best to help locate the suitcase's owner. After the call, Sarah felt a relief mixed with the anxiety of the unknown. She knew she had done the right thing, but she also worried about the possible consequences. What if the suitcase's owner did not react well? What if she was misunderstood? The uncertainty made her feel uneasy. As night approached, Sarah returned to the apartment exhausted. The weight of the suitcase had been replaced by the weight of her conscience, and the pain of realizing she was still in the same situation began to set in. Yet, there was a sense of inner peace that came from knowing she had acted with integrity. As she prepared for bed, Sarah thought about the suitcase and what might come next. She hoped that her decision would not be in vain, and that the suitcase's owner, when they learned the truth, would understand and appreciate the gesture of honesty. The future was still uncertain, but at least Sarah knew she had done what she believed was right. In her mind, Sarah wondered how her life might change with a simple act of honesty. She hoped that by returning the suitcase, something good would come back to her, a small reward for the effort and difficult choice she had made. But for now, her hope was tied to the expectation of a better future and the desire to create a safe and loving home for the baby that was about to be born. Sarah Thompson stood at the entrance of an elegant office building in downtown, holding the suitcase with both hands. The imposing structure and gleaming glass reflected the sunlight, highlighting the contrast between the world of luxury and her own. The receptionist in the lobby looked at her with curiosity, noting her tired appearance and the large suitcase Sarah carried. "Hello, I'm here to return a suitcase I found," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It seems to belong to a client of the security company I contacted." The receptionist picked up the phone and made a quick call, informing the security company about Sarah's arrival. After a few minutes of waiting, a well-dressed man entered the lobby. He was Edward Harrison, a successful millionaire known for his fortune and involvement in various charitable causes. Edward was a tall and elegant man with a presence that exuded power and confidence. When he saw Sarah, his expression changed from surprise to a mix of relief and curiosity. He approached her with a smile. "You must be the person who found my suitcase," Edward said, extending his hand to shake hers. "I'm Edward Harrison. Thank you so much for coming here to return it." Sarah handed the suitcase to Edward, her eyes meeting his. "It was my pleasure to return it. I knew it was very important and couldn't keep what wasn't mine." Edward examined the suitcase and noted the genuine relief in his eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me. There was a significant amount of money and important documents in the suitcase. Without you, I would have faced a great loss." "I just did what I thought was right," Sarah replied, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "It wasn't easy to decide what to do, but I knew it was the best choice." Edward was impressed not only by Sarah's honesty, but also by her humility. He looked at her closely, noticing the exhaustion in her face and the wear on her clothes. It was evident that she was going through difficulties. "I would like to do something to thank you properly," Edward said. "If you don't mind, I'd like to offer you a job at my home. We need a housekeeper, and I believe you would be a great addition to our team." Sarah was surprised by the offer. She hesitated for a moment, her thoughts swirling around the proposal and what it would mean for her life. Working for someone like Edward Harrison could be a significant opportunity for change, but it also meant entering a completely different world. I don't know what to say," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. "This seems like a big step." Edward smiled. "You don't need to decide immediately. Take some time to think about it. I'll leave you my contact information so you can let me know when you're ready. And if you need any financial support in the meantime, please don't hesitate to let me know." He handed Sarah a card with his phone number and contact information. Edward's offer was generous and unexpected, and she knew it was a significant step toward a better future. Although part of her was still skeptical and unsure, the promise of a new opportunity was tempting. After the conversation, Sarah thanked Edward and left the building, carrying not only the contact card, but also a renewed sense of hope. The sun was starting to set, and the city seemed a little brighter to her at that moment. As she returned to her apartment, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on Edward's offer. The job as a housekeeper in a millionaire's home represented a chance to escape poverty and start a new life. She knew she would have to face a very different environment from what she was used to, but she also knew it was an opportunity she couldn't afford to waste. While preparing dinner in her small apartment, Sarah pondered how life could change with this new opportunity. The idea of having a steady job and a more stable work environment seemed almost surreal, but the hope for a better future was a comfort. Edward's offer was more than just a job. It was a chance to restart and provide a better future for her baby. Sarah decided she would accept Edward's offer. She felt this was the opportunity she had been waiting for, and while she was nervous about what the future held, she was ready to face the challenges ahead. She would call Edward the next morning to accept the offer and start preparing for a new phase of her life. That night, as she prepared for bed, Sarah looked at the ultrasound photo of her baby, which was in a simple frame on her nightstand. She smiled, thinking about how things could improve and how her decision to return the suitcase could lead to a significant change. The future was still uncertain, but Sarah's hope and determination were stronger than ever. She was ready to face the next stage of her journey with courage and optimism. Sarah Thompson arrived at Edward Harrison's mansion with a mix of nervousness and excitement. The enormous wrought iron gate opened to reveal a path flanked by well-manicured gardens and an imposing building that seemed almost like a castle. Every detail of the place exuded wealth and opulence, a stark contrast to the simple and harsh life Sarah had known. She was greeted by a butler, Jameson, who led her through the mansion's luxurious hallways. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, and the marble floors gleamed beneath her feet. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach as she realized the magnitude of the environment she was about to work in. Jameson took her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, was preparing breakfast. The housekeeper was a middle-aged woman with a stern look, but she offered Sarah a courteous smile and an evaluative glance. "Welcome, Sarah," Mrs. Barlow said, with a tone that mixed formality and curiosity. "I hope you're ready to adapt to this new environment. Edward informed us of your arrival." Sarah nodded, trying to appear confident as she prepared to start her new job. The mansion's kitchen was enormous, equipped with every imaginable modern appliance. Although the environment was impressive, Sarah knew that adjusting to her new life wouldn't be easy. The first week was a whirlwind of new routines and responsibilities. Sarah quickly learned to manage the complexities of the job, from organizing the cabinets to preparing sophisticated meals for Edward and his guests. She strived to be efficient and attentive, trying to integrate into the new environment and gain the acceptance of the team. During the initial weeks, Sarah had the opportunity to converse more with Edward. They discussed various topics, from politics to books they both enjoyed. Sarah found Edward to be a kind and genuine person, and the connection between them began to grow. Edward seemed interested in her story and showed a sincere concern for her well-being. However, not everything was harmonious in the mansion. Margaret Harrison, Edward's wife, had a distant and often cold demeanor. Margaret was an elegant and well-groomed woman, but there was something in her presence that created palpable tension. She didn't seem to appreciate Sarah's presence in the house, and although she didn't openly express her hostility, her actions made it clear she was unhappy with the new employee. Margaret's hostility manifested in small gestures and indirect comments. One day, as Sarah was cleaning the living room, Margaret walked in, passing by her with a look of disdain. "I hope you know where you're putting things," Margaret murmured, her tone laden with sarcasm. "I don't want to find anything out of place." Margaret merely shook her head and left the room, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of the situation. The strained relationship with Margaret was beginning to affect Sarah's confidence and emotional state. She wondered if Margaret's hostility was merely a reflection of her own insecurity, or if there was something more behind her behavior. Despite the difficulties with Margaret, Sarah found comfort in her conversations with Edward and in the small daily victories. She made an effort to do her best work and tried to keep the hope alive that, over time, things might improve. The growing friendship with Edward was a source of support and encouragement, and she clung to the promise of a better future. One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing items in the kitchen, Edward walked in and found her focused on her work. He smiled when he saw her. "You're doing a great job, Sarah. I appreciate how much effort you're putting in." Sarah smiled timidly. "Thank you, Edward. I'm trying to adjust as best as I can." Edward noticed the fatigue and tension on Sarah's face and decided to do something to alleviate the pressure. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask me. And if there's something specific I can do to make your work here easier, let me know." Sarah felt a sense of relief upon hearing these words. Edward's concern and support were reassuring and gave her the strength to keep facing the challenges. Although life in the mansion was still complicated and full of obstacles, Edward's presence offered a ray of hope and a reminder that, despite the difficulties, there was something good in her new life. Over time, Sarah began to adapt to the mansion's sophisticated environment, and her interactions with Edward became more natural and comfortable. Margaret's hostility was still a challenge, but Sarah was determined to maintain her professionalism and continue seeking a better future for herself and her baby. The new life in the mansion was a different world, full of complexities, but Sarah was willing to face it all with courage and hope. As the weeks went by, Margaret Harrison's hostility towards Sarah Thompson became more evident and aggressive. Margaret's palpable envy and resentment towards the new employee led her to take more direct actions to sabotage Sarah. Although her behavior remained masked by courtesy, her actions increasingly undermined Sarah in visible ways. One morning, while Sarah was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, she noticed that some utensils and ingredients were out of place. She found a note in a kitchen drawer with a request from Margaret to prepare a special meal for an event she was planning. Sarah was used to last-minute requests, but this task seemed intentionally challenging. The recipe required missing ingredients, forcing Sarah to improvise and do the best she could. Later, during the event, Margaret made a point to criticize the food Sarah had prepared. She loudly commented on the lack of flavor and inadequate presentation, creating unnecessary embarrassment for Sarah. Edward, who was present, tried to downplay the situation, but Sarah felt the humiliation and the weight of Margaret's words. In addition to her public criticisms, Margaret began sabotaging Sarah's work in more subtle ways. She hid important items, swapped ingredients in recipes, and made adjustments to task lists that caused problems in organizing the house. Each day seemed to bring a new difficulty, and Sarah felt increasingly demoralized. The situation reached a critical point when Sarah discovered that some valuables were missing from the mansion. Jewelry and money had disappeared, and Edward was visibly disturbed. With her history of struggle and honesty, Sarah was worried about the implications of these losses. She feared that the situation could be used against her, but she knew she was not the actual culprit. The atmosphere in the mansion grew increasingly tense. Edward was frustrated and began to distrust those around him, unsure of whom to trust. He started investigating the losses and looking for clues, which only heightened the nervousness of everyone in the house. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her malicious actions. She had started stealing money from Edward, hiding bills in discreet places, and creating a narrative to divert attention. Her envy had turned into destructive behavior, and she was willing to do anything to maintain her position of power and control. The tension in the house began to directly affect Sarah and her emotional well-being. She was constantly stressed and worried about being falsely accused. The insecurity was impacting her health and consequently her baby's health. She felt anxious and sad, and the sense of being constantly watched and distrusted weighed heavily on her shoulders. One particularly difficult night, Sarah lay in bed with a racing heart and a mind full of worries. The work environment, which had once seemed promising, was now turning into an emotional battleground. Margaret's actions and Edward's growing distrust were creating an unbearable atmosphere. Margaret, in a moment of calculated cruelty, decided to exploit this emotional tension to her advantage. She spread rumors and misinformation about Sarah to the household staff, fostering the idea that Sarah was untrustworthy. Margaret wanted to ensure that Sarah was seen with suspicion by everyone, isolating her further and increasing the pressure on her. The emotional impact of Margaret's actions on Sarah's life became evident. She became more reclusive and avoided unnecessary interactions with Margaret and other household members. The stress was affecting her physical and mental health, and her concern for her baby's well-being consumed her. Sarah tried to stay strong, but the constant sabotage and hostile environment were beginning to wear her down. She knew she needed to protect her job and ensure her baby's safety, but the growing tension was making this increasingly difficult. On a night when Edward was away on a business trip, Margaret made a bold move. She went to Edward's office and began rummaging through his drawers in search of money. However, Sarah, who was working late in the house, noticed something suspicious. She heard noises coming from the office and decided to investigate. Upon opening the door, Sarah caught Margaret in the act, trying to hide money in a bag. Margaret was shocked to see Sarah and immediately tried to justify herself, but the damage was done. Sarah had witnessed the theft, and the situation could not be ignored. "Margaret, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm despite her indignation. Margaret, with a panicked expression, tried to give confusing explanations. "You don't know what you're talking about, Sarah. You can't accuse me without proof." Sarah knew she needed to act quickly. She went to Edward's office and searched for additional evidence to corroborate what she had seen. She found transaction records and other items that proved the money was missing. With a heavy heart, she decided to show Edward what she had discovered. When Edward came home that night, Sarah confronted him with the evidence. Edward, shocked and embarrassed by the situation, confronted Margaret. The revelation of the theft and sabotage caused an explosive reaction in the house, and tensions reached a peak. Margaret, confronted and with no more lies to tell, tried to defend herself, but the evidence was irrefutable. Edward was devastated by his wife's betrayal and the way the situation had unfolded. The situation resulted in a drastic decision. Edward decided to remove Margaret from the mansion and begin a separation process. The separation and Margaret's actions had a profound impact on Sarah, who was relieved to have revealed the truth, but was still dealing with the emotional scars. Sarah knew her life at the mansion was changing again. Although Margaret was no longer in the house, the experience had left deep scars. She continued to face the challenges of her new environment, but the revelation of the theft and separation from Margaret were an important step in restoring order and trust in the household. Edward did his best to support Sarah during this difficult time. He encouraged her to seek help with her stress and offered additional support to ensure she was taking good care of herself and her baby. Although the tension and emotional impact were still present, the truth had been revealed, and Sarah was one step closer to finding the peace and stability she sought. The night was silent at the mansion, but the atmosphere was charged with tension. Sarah Thompson was in her room, trying to relax, when she heard the quick footsteps of Edward Harrison approaching. He was clearly disturbed, and the feeling of unease in the house seemed palpable. Sarah braced herself to face the consequences of the recent revelations and hoped things would be resolved fairly. Edward entered Sarah's room with a grave and tired expression. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice laden with concern. Sarah nodded, feeling a tightness in her chest. She knew Edward had discovered the evidence about Margaret's theft and was about to deal with the situation. "Of course, Edward. What's going on?" Edward sat down beside her, looking exhausted. "I revealed everything you showed me about the theft and sabotage. I conducted a more thorough investigation and uncovered the extent of Margaret's actions. She was embezzling money and trying to undermine you. I didn't realize how much she was betraying me until now." Sarah looked at Edward with a mix of relief and sadness. "I knew something was wrong. I'm relieved you discovered the truth." Edward took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I'm devastated, Sarah. Margaret not only stole from me, but also tried to manipulate the situation against you. The truth is, the mistrust and hostility you faced were caused by her, not by you." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. "I just did my job and tried to be honest. I didn't expect to face this situation." Edward reached out and held Sarah's hand, looking at her with sincerity. "I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for what you've been through. Margaret was responsible for all this confusion, and I want to make it right." He paused before continuing. "I've made a decision. Margaret is being removed from the mansion, and the separation is underway. I can't continue with her, knowing what she did. But besides that, I need to be honest with you about my feelings." Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding. "About your feelings?" Edward nodded. "Yes. Throughout all this time, I've realized something I didn't expect. I've developed feelings for you, Sarah. The way you've handled everything, your honesty and strength, have made me see you in a different light. I would like to be with you." Edward's words were a shock to Sarah. She was surprised and touched, but it also felt a mix of complex emotions. "Edward, I don't know what to say. This is unexpected." Edward squeezed her hand tenderly. "I know it's unexpected and complicated, but regardless, I want you to know that you are important to me. I want you and your son to be well, and I hope we can build something together." Sarah looked at him, contemplating the offer and the meaning of his words. The decision to face her feelings and the changes in her life was in her hands. She felt she had a future to consider, and the responsibility of caring for her child. "Edward," she began, "this is a lot to process. I appreciate your honesty and the support you've given me, but I need to think about all this and decide what's best for me and my child." Edward understood and nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm here to support you, and regardless of your decision, I will do my best to ensure you and your son have what you need." Sarah thanked Edward and decided she needed time to process the situation. She retreated to her room, where she was alone with her thoughts. Edward's offer and Margaret's separation represented a new phase in her life, but she needed to reflect on how this fit into her plans and her future. The next morning, Sarah felt a bit more clear-headed. She realized she had faced many difficulties and challenges over the past months, and Edward's offer was a significant opportunity. She also knew she needed to consider what was best for her child and her own emotional well-being. She found Edward in the kitchen, where he was having breakfast. He looked at her with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Sarah approached and began to speak. "Edward, I spent the night thinking about all this," Sarah said. "I deeply appreciate what you've done for me and the way you've supported me. The offer to be with you is something I never imagined, but I also see how this could be an opportunity for us." Edward looked at her attentively. "I understand it's a big decision. Whatever you decide, I will respect." Sarah took a deep breath and continued, "I want to give this a chance. I want to see where it could lead us, not only for me, but for my child as well. I think we deserve to explore this possibility and see if we can build something together." Edward smiled, visibly relieved and happy. "That means a lot to me, Sarah. I will do everything I can to ensure everything is the best for you and your son." With the decision made, Sarah began to adapt to a new phase of her life. Margaret's separation brought relief and a sense of justice, and the new perspective of being with Edward represented an opportunity for a fresh start. Although the future was still uncertain and full of challenges, Sarah was ready to face whatever came with hope and determination. The new phase of her life promised to be different and full of possibilities. Sarah was willing to explore this new opportunity and see how it could transform her future and her child's future. The journey that had begun with challenges and trials was now opening up to a new chapter, and Sarah was ready to write this story with courage and optimism. After Edward and Sarah decided to move forward together, Edward's mansion began to transform into a new home for them. The environment, once marked by tensions and difficulties, was now filled with a renewed energy. Sarah was determined to make this new phase work and ensure that her baby, who was about to be born, would adapt well to the new situation. The anticipation of the birth was in the air, and Edward was committed to making the transition as smooth as possible. Together, they prepared a special room for the baby, decorating it with soft colors and toys that Sarah had chosen with care. The room had a beautiful view of the garden, and Sarah believed this would help the baby feel more comfortable and happy. As time went on, preparations for the birth intensified. Sarah and Edward went through a period of intense anticipation and preparation. Edward proved to be a supportive and attentive partner throughout the pregnancy, attending medical appointments and helping organize the house for the baby's arrival. Finally, the night of the birth arrived. Sarah was nervous, but also eager to welcome her child. Edward was by her side during labor, offering support and unconditional love. When the baby was born, it was a moment of pure joy and relief. Sarah held the little one in her arms, tears of happiness in her eyes, while Edward looked on with an emotional smile. After the arrival of the baby, named Ben, Sarah and Edward began to adjust to the new family dynamic. The environment in the mansion, which had once been filled with tension, was now vibrant and full of hope. Edward and Sarah were dedicated to creating a welcoming environment adapted to Ben's needs. During the first few weeks, Sarah and Ben went through an adjustment period. Ben, accustomed to a simpler life, took some time to adapt to the new environment. At first, he was a bit reserved and hesitant, but Edward made a conscious effort to interact with him, taking him for walks in the garden and playing with him. Gradually, Ben began to open up and feel more at ease. He made friends among the household staff and found joy in exploring the gardens and leisure areas of the mansion. Edward, with patience and dedication, won Ben's trust, and Sarah saw her son become a happier and more relaxed child. On a sunny weekend, Edward organized a small picnic in the mansion's garden to celebrate their new phase of life as a family. Sarah prepared some of her favorite recipes, and Edward made a point to involve Ben in the preparation, helping to make sandwiches and juices. The picnic was an opportunity for them to come together and enjoy a moment of joy and relaxation. During the picnic, Edward stood up to make a toast. He looked at Sarah and Ben with a warm smile. I want to take this moment to thank everyone for being here and for being part of this new journey. I am very grateful to have Sarah and Ben in my life. They have brought a new light into my life, and I am looking forward to the future we will build together. Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude and happiness. I am also grateful for everything we have now. This is a new chance for all of us, and I am excited to see what the future holds. The picnic was a success, and the joyful and welcoming atmosphere helped solidify the new family dynamic. Edward and Sarah began to plan regular family activities and create traditions that would help strengthen their bond. They explored new activities together, such as hiking, biking, and visiting museums, and these experiences helped create lasting memories. Despite all the changes and challenges they had faced, Edward and Sarah found a new balance in their lives. Their relationship grew stronger as they worked together to build a united and loving family. Ben's presence brought a new perspective and joy, and they were determined to make this new phase the best it could be for everyone. Sarah also found support in a network of friends and former colleagues who helped her adapt to her new life. They encouraged her to continue pursuing her dreams and seek opportunities that fulfilled her. Sarah began to explore new interests and activities, and her sense of purpose and self-confidence grew. Over time, the mansion became a vibrant and lively home. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, love, and a sense of renewal. The journey that had begun with challenges and difficulties was now transforming into a story of hope and new beginnings. Sarah, Edward, and Ben's life was far from perfect, but they learned to face challenges together and cherish simple and meaningful moments. Their love and mutual support helped them overcome adversities and build a promising future. As Sarah looked to the future, she felt a deep gratitude for everything she had achieved and for the new family she had formed. Although life would never be completely free of difficulties, she was confident that with love and determination, she could face any challenge that came her way. In the end, the story of Sarah, Edward, and Ben was one of overcoming and renewal. They found a new beginning amid adversity and discovered the power of love and hope to transform their lives. With a heart full of gratitude and a resilient spirit, Sarah was ready to continue her journey, embracing all the possibilities and challenges that the future had to offer. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. Like to show your support and leave a comment. We want to hear your thoughts.